Have you ever felt like there's something hidden, something mysteriously absent, when reading the book of Genesis? Not a single word, not a mere sentence, but an entire presence lost, like a shadow lingering just out of reach. Before the light was called into being, before the Spirit hovered over the deep, there was something else, something ancient, that was deliberately kept from our eyes. A chapter, a story not erased by time, but intentionally removed by those in power. Why? What could be so dangerous that it had to be buried under layers of history and tradition? What if I told you that the version of Genesis we know is only the tip of the iceberg, and what lies beneath tells a darker, more complex story? A story of fallen stars, forbidden knowledge, and a battle that began before humanity even took its first breath. This isn't just a conspiracy or a legend. It's a reality long suppressed, hidden by the very hands that promised to protect the faith. The elders of Israel, guardians of the sacred text, chose order over truth, silencing a chaos that could unravel everything. But what if that chaos was the key to understanding the very origins of creation? What if the secrets they tried to hide are the ones that can unlock your understanding of the world today? I invite you to journey with me into this forgotten chapter, where truth and silence collide, and discover the echoes of a story they never wanted you to hear. Are you ready to uncover what has been buried for centuries? Leave a 757 in the comments if you feel the pull of this mystery. And thank you for your support through Super. Thanks as always. Now let's step into the shadows of the past and see what secrets are waiting to be uncovered. The Lost Book, cut from Genesis. What dark secret did Israel's elders hide? Part 1, Genesis, the missing foundation. Imagine for a moment that you are standing at the very threshold of eternity, holding the ancient scrolls of Genesis in your hands. You unroll them, breathless with anticipation, expecting to witness the first breath of existence, the pure, untouched moment when God would have spoken everything into glorious being from a pristine blank slate. Yet what greets you instead? A scene already thick with shadows. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless, and empty darkness was over the surface of the deep. Pause. Feel that chill. Doesn't it strike you as odd that the Bible's grand opening doesn't start with a fresh canvas? There's no graceful unveiling of an untouched masterpiece. Instead, you're immediately confronted by something eerily incomplete, a desolate, shapeless wasteland, cloaked in darkness, as if you've stumbled upon the aftermath of a cosmic calamity. Can you sense it? It's as though Genesis begins by whispering about something that's already gone terribly wrong. Why would the very first chapter of the Bible, meant to unveil the origins of everything, open upon a stage littered with broken pieces? Shouldn't the divine story have launched from a place of pure possibility, immaculate and flawless? Why do we step into a void that seems to remember a violent history? And here's a thought that might stir your spirit even deeper. What if what we call Genesis chapter 1 is not truly the beginning? What if it's actually the second act, the rebuilding after some unimaginable ruin? This isn't some wild fringe speculation dreamt up by restless minds. For centuries, rabbis poring over these words by lamplight, theologians penning volumes from candlelit desks, and historians scouring clay tablets have all wrestled with the same haunting tension. In Hebrew, the phrase tohu vabohu, formless and void, carries far more weight than mere poetic description. It crackles with judgment, heavy with the sense of devastation. It suggests not just emptiness, but desolation left by some prior catastrophe. Almost like stumbling onto a crime scene, where the chalk outlines have long since faded, yet the air still tastes of sorrow. Could this be why Jeremiah once wrote, "I looked at the earth, and it was formless and empty, and at the heavens, and their light was gone"? Jeremiah 4:23. Was he alluding to a primordial echo that still haunted Israel's memory, a ruin older than time as we know it? So what dark story unfolded before the Spirit of God hovered over these chaotic waters? What narrative was so perilous, so volatile, that it was deliberately left out of the sacred opening lines? Could it be that the very foundation of our faith stands atop the ashes of a secret God chose not to reveal fully? At least, not yet. Because you see, Genesis isn't merely an origin story. It's a soaring declaration of who God is and who you are meant to be. It's theology woven into the fabric of history. It tells us that God reigns sovereign over all, that creation is inherently good, that humanity was crafted with divine intention. But have you ever wondered whether this majestic architecture was erected upon rubble over the remnants of a former reality swept away to make room for something better? Does Genesis read less like a first draft and more like a rebuilding after a mysterious reset? Let's linger here a little longer. So many have said Genesis is the first word of God to humankind, yet look closely. In the Jewish telling, the very first divine act is not creation, it is separation. God divides the light from the darkness. But separated from what was there darkness, already woven into the cosmos, waiting to be untangled. The text never tells us how that darkness arrived. It simply exists silent and ominous, as if it had always been there, a shadow without origin. If you were standing there on that primordial shore, peering into the black depths, wouldn't you ache to ask, what came before this? What ancient sorrow lies buried beneath these waters? And perhaps most uncomfortably, what might still be lurking in the deep, just beyond the reach of divine light? Now pause with me and let this notion seep deep into your bones. If the very first lines of the Bible unveil a world already fractured, and God's earliest work is no sheer creation, but urgent restoration, doesn't it make you wonder what dreadful tale came before that darkness? Could the answer lie in a war so ancient, so catastrophic, that its echoes still tremble beneath every verse? Could it be that Genesis hides the scars of the oldest forgotten war ever waged, a rebellion not of mortals, but of immortals? Suddenly, you're no longer just reading Genesis like a quaint book of origins taught in Sunday school. You're deciphering a secret code, sifting through whispers of a cataclysm so profound that its aftermath became the very stage for our own story. It's as if there's a chasm gaping wide, right there in the text, a gap disguised as a simple beginning, yet teeming with unspoken terror. And before you think this is just some fringe speculation, dreamed up by midnight theologians, listen to the voices of the ancients. Early church fathers, men like Origen, who spent his life plumbing the depths of divine mysteries, and Irenaeus, who sought to trace every heresy back to its shadow, both alluded to a pre-creation insurrection. Even the rabbis of old and the Jewish mystics spoke of realms that shattered long before God ever uttered, "Let there be light." They envisioned worlds that rose and fell like fragile glass towers, each break ringing out across eternity. Have you ever heard of the Kabbalistic teaching of Shevirat HaKelim, the breaking of the vessels? It's a haunting idea that divine light, too powerful to be contained, once burst forth in a violent blaze, splintering creation itself and scattering shards of holy fire into the void. What if that's the story that was edited out? What was so frightening, so scandalous, that the sacred record skips straight over it? Why is there no chapter chronicling the moment when darkness triumphed, when heaven itself ruptured, and something unspeakably unholy crawled forth from the wreckage? Genesis stands as the beginning, yes, But doesn't it feel more like the first page of a new volume after another book was ripped away? What calamity was deemed so dangerous to know that it had to be scrubbed from the sacred archives? Picture yourself as a high priest draped in linen robes, standing before the Holy of Holies, the keeper of divine secrets. Would you truly hand over to trembling humanity the revelation that before Adam ever stumbled, angels did? That the original betrayal did not unfold in Eden under a tree, but erupted in heaven itself, under God's very gaze? That the greatest war was not waged between man and God, but between light clashing against light, brother against brother, in realms beyond mortal comprehension? Could you bear to inscribe that on holy parchment, knowing it would shake humanity's fragile sense of safety? No. You'd lock it away. You'd shape the narrative, to begin with a God who mends what is broken, not a God who once looked upon his own majestic creations and recoiled at what they had become. You'd keep silent about the rebellion in heaven, so that humanity would never question how close ruin still lurks to glory. But here's a chilling thought. Every attempt to erase leaves behind a faint trace, like an ancient watermark bleeding through the pages. And Genesis carries one such ghostly imprint. It opens with a world that should be teeming with light and song, yet it yawns empty, steeped in shadow. Darkness lies sprawled across the deep, unexplained and patient, as if it remembers a time when it wasn't banished at all. And the silence, it's so profound that if you stand too close, you might almost hear it, like the muffled echo of a scream that never fully died. What if Genesis isn't the pristine opening act we've always believed? What if it's actually the second attempt, a divine do-over, etched onto a scarred canvas, still faintly stained by what came before? Hold tightly to that possibility, because where we go next will test your courage. In the coming moments, we'll step beyond the lines of canon into the lost books, the buried scrolls, the forbidden tales, the stories they desperately hoped time would swallow, and you would never dare to unearth. And that, dear soul, is where the fragile seams of everything begin to tear wide open. Part 2. The Forbidden Books. Picture yourself in a dimly lit chamber, lined with ancient scrolls, the air heavy with the scent of old parchment and lingering incense. Somewhere in this sacred vault lies Genesis, but flanking it once upon a time were other books, voices of a lost age that have now been severed from our collective memory. If Genesis feels like it opens halfway through a story, already brimming with secrets, then perhaps these missing texts are the torn-out pages that once filled in the silence. Scholars today might call them by intimidating, brittle-sounding names: the Apocrypha, the Pseudepigrapha. Words that echo with academic coldness, tucked safely away on library shelves, gathering dust. But what if these weren't just theological footnotes? What if these were the very heartbeats of a world before our own, the whispered confessions of creation's earliest wounds? Consider for a moment books like Enoch, Jubilees, and Jasher were not obscure fringe writings. They were cherished, read aloud in gatherings of the faithful, copied meticulously by scribes who wept over their lines. Jewish sages preserved them early. Christians debated and even quoted them. The Bible itself nods to their existence. Joshua 10:13 mentions the book of Jasher, as if everyone simply knew it. 2 Samuel 1:18 does the same almost casually. And Jude, that short, thunderous letter near the end of the New Testament, dares to quote Enoch outright. Behold, the Lord comes with 10,000s of his holy ones to execute judgment on all. Jude 1:14-15. So, why then are these books no longer nestled among Genesis and Exodus on your shelf? Why were they exiled from the canon, locked out of the official story we've been handed? It's because they don't just recount creation in poetic strokes. They peel back the veil on the very terrors Genesis only dares to whisper about. They answer questions most would tremble to even voice. Of all these haunted texts, the Book of Enoch may be the most unsettling. Imagine opening its pages and reading that before the floodwaters ever raced across the earth, there was another more sinister flood, a deluge of angelic rebellion. The Watchers, divine beings stationed as guardians over the realms of men, looked down from their lofty posts and burned with forbidden desire. They longed for human daughters, not with holy compassion, but with hungry eyes. And so they descended, tearing the delicate membrane that separated heaven's purity from earth's fragility. Then came the gifts, or were they curses masquerading as wisdom? They taught mankind secrets we were never meant to grasp. The art of manipulating creation itself, the forging of metal into weapons sharp enough to carve empires out of flesh, the dark sciences of conjuring spirits, peering beyond mortal sight into vistas only angels were licensed to behold. Can you almost feel the shiver running through humanity's bones as these mysteries spilled out? This was no benign enlightenment. It was a catastrophic transfer of power, a rewriting of destinies, the birth of nightmares. From these illicit unions sprang forth a breed neither wholly divine nor fully human, the Nephilim. Giants, towering monstrosities with appetites too vast for earth to sustain, hearts too blackened for heaven to redeem. The Book of Enoch says they ravaged the land, devouring beasts and men, even one another, in their insatiable bloodlust. The world became a grisly banquet hall, drenched in gore, and God looked upon it. And for the first time in the sacred record, we hear of divine regret. Pause and let that echo. This isn't the serene, ordered creator of Genesis 1, smiling upon good earth and bright stars. This is a God forced into crisis intervention, compelled to wipe clean a canvas that had become a grotesque parody of his original design. And doesn't that change how you hear Genesis 6:4? There were giants in the earth in those days, and also afterward. A cryptic line that dangles without explanation. Who were these giants? How did they emerge? Who sowed the seeds of violence and seduction? Long before humanity was prepared to wield such knowledge, Genesis offers only sparse hints, enough to stir unease, but never enough to satisfy the questions clawing at the edges of your mind. It never names the Watchers. It never recounts who first showed men how to draw metal from rock and shape it into swords. Why leave those shadows unexplored? Because the truths you seek lie in the very books that were deliberately excised from the canon stories, banished for being too incendiary, too revealing of a cosmos once far darker than we dare imagine. And so here we stand with Genesis in our hands, but haunted by ghosts of chapters that once encircled it, whispering of angelic lust, monstrous offspring, and a God who mourned what his creation had spiraled into. Does it make you wonder what else was locked away, for fear it would shatter our fragile trust in the narrative we were allowed to keep? Now draw a little closer. Let's unroll another ancient scroll that many have tried to keep sealed, the Book of Jubilees. Imagine reading Genesis again, but this time not as a sparse human memory, but as a divine briefing. In Jubilees, it is the angels themselves who recount the deep past to Moses, guiding his understanding with the authority of heaven. It's a cosmic audit, a sacred chronology carved from the very mouth of eternity. What immediately stands out is how relentlessly it points to the heavenly tablet's intricate records, kept beyond mortal reach, inscribed with the full scope of God's knowledge and decrees. Think of them as celestial ledgers that document not just what happened, but why it mattered eternally. Have you ever wondered if such books truly exist, cataloging your own steps, your secret choices, the hidden bends of your heart? Jubilees does something unwealthy daring. It calls out the angels by name. It does not soften their rebellions into vague poetry. It exposes precisely who defied God and how their acts rippled through creation. It layers new details over familiar tales. Cain and Abel's tragic end becomes more than a mere fratricide. It is intertwined with spiritual forces stirring unseen around them. The story of the flood grows sharper, more fraught with heavenly politics and ancient pacts. Jubilees even dares to reveal that long before Sinai blazed with divine fire, laws were already whispered into human ears by angelic voices. Imagine commandments not first thundered from the mountain, but carried down softly on wings long before Moses ever climbed the heights. And what does this imply? That humanity was never the only actor in our collective downfall. The fall was crowded. Angels stood there too, some pulling us deeper into darkness, others weeping as they watched. Doesn't that reframe how you see your own struggles, your temptations? Perhaps your private battles echo far older rivalries, still swirling in the unseen realms. Then there is Jasher, the so-called upright record, a text that once draped itself around Genesis like a rich embroidered cloak. Jasher fills the silent gaps of Scripture with names, motives, and consequences that breathe intense life into the old stories. In its pages, the antediluvian world, that strange civilization before the flood, gleams with startling sophistication. Jasher hints at technologies and spiritual practices that far outstripped what we typically imagine of primitive humankind. Could it be that this world soared too high, too quickly becoming a new Babel, long before Babel ever stacked its bricks? Was the flood not just a cleansing, but a mercy that stopped humanity from tearing the veil entirely and plunging headlong into forbidden realms? Then return with me once more to Enoch, the text that refuses to rest quietly. It tells us that when judgment finally thundered down, the watchers, those angels who traded heaven's glories for earthly pleasures, were not merely destroyed. They were chained, bound alive in the bowels of the earth, reserved for a future reckoning still looming ahead. Why chain them instead of snuffing them out? Because their crime was singular. They had not only betrayed God by their lusts, but had dared to share heaven's inner architecture with mortal hands. They spilled the secrets of the beginning and the end, the coded blueprints of how stars dance, how winds circle the globe, how blades are shaped to rule, and how adornment seduces the eye. They gave away the very algorithms of creation itself. For such trespass, they were not granted simple death. They were sentenced to watch in shackles the unfolding ages they had corrupted. And these stories do not be too quick to dismiss them as colorful folklore. They were once read with trembling reverence. They were meant as stark warnings, warnings so unsettling that later gatekeepers of doctrine quietly stripped them from the canon, layering them with skepticism until they sounded like mere legend. But the bones of these tales have endured. They survive in Ethiopian Bibles, proudly preserving Enoch, in tattered manuscripts pulled from clay jars, in desert caves near Qumran, their fragile pages rediscovered only in the last century. It's almost as if God allowed them to resurface, precisely when the modern world had grown bold enough to believe it could unravel every mystery on its own. So step back and see this chilling mosaic take shape. Genesis didn't conceal the war. It began with the aftermath, the scorched remnants of a rebellion so immense it shattered both heaven's ranks and earth's innocence. Genesis was never about hiding the conflict. It was about starting the cleanup, repairing a universe left quaking from wounds that still bleed through time. And brace yourself. In the next unfolding of this revelation, we will plunge even deeper into this first celestial insurrection, into the tragic saga of the Watchers, the monstrous rise of the Nephilim, and that harrowing instant when heaven touched earth and fractured everything we now hold dear. Keep your eyes wide open. What's waiting ahead might forever change how you see not only the flood and the fall, but even the meaning of the cross itself. Part 3. The Lost Chapter. Legend or truth? Now allow yourself to drift into a realm between shadow and memory. Imagine just for a breath that the book of Genesis once cradled another chapter 1 that began not with radiant light piercing the void, but with searing fire tearing through heaven itself. A chapter drenched not in gentle creation, but in the ferocious birth pains of cosmic rebellion. Could it be that this chapter was not omitted because it whispered falsehoods, but precisely because it shouted truths too volatile for fragile mortals to bear? We've caught whispers of this forbidden tale in the remnants of Enoch, in the solemn recountings of Jubilees, and in the textured scrolls of Jasher. But what if these were only echoes, fragile reflections of a story far older, once proudly etched into Genesis itself, before trembling hands tore it away, hoping silence might protect us from its devastating revelations? This lost chapter doesn't open in Eden's gentle breezes. It unfolds in an age before Adam's first breath, before the tree of knowledge sank its roots into innocent soil. According to these ancient, often banned sources, there existed another knowledge far more ancient, dangerously sacred, and so devastating that even heaven's halls quivered under its weight. Long before human footprints traced the dust of this young planet, there dwelt a mighty assembly of celestial beings known as the Watchers. They were appointed by God, not to reign, but to vigilantly guard and guide. Imagine them poised on the precipice of heaven, eyes wide with wonder at this fragile experiment below. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, something within them twisted. They gazed upon humankind and felt more than holy duty. They saw beauty that stirred desire, potential that inflamed ambition. Could you imagine standing among them? Would your own heart have remained pure? At the heart of this quiet storm stood a formidable figure named Samjaza. With words that dripped like sweet venom, he forged a pact among his brethren. They would descend together, crossing the sacred boundary that separated the eternal from the temporal. They would take human daughters as their wives, share with them the mysteries of heaven, and shape a world that bent to their designs. They called it enlightenment, perhaps even love. But God called it betrayal. For what they unveiled was not innocent knowledge. It was the very scaffolding of creation, primal technology, divine blueprints, the spiritual DNA that undergirds the cosmos itself. They revealed the secret art of metallurgy, how to tear raw ore from the earth's heart and forge it into weapons sharp enough to carve destinies. They taught enchantments that snared spirits and manipulated minds, mapped the stars to unlock the cryptic corridors of time, and cloaked desire in dazzling adornments that seduced not only the flesh, but the soul. These were not harmless curiosities. They were accelerants that set humanity ablaze, burning far faster and wilder than God had intended. And from this unholy union sprang forth the Nephilim giants, whose bodies melded heaven's essence with earth's clay. They weren't merely enormous creatures. They were paradoxes, given flesh spirits too heavy for the skies, yet unbounded by earthly frailty. Imagine living in their shadow. What would you feel? Awe, terror, perhaps an unspoken envy at their terrible freedom. Scripture gives us only a glimpse. The earth also was corrupt before God, and the earth was filled with violence. Genesis 6:11. But Enoch dares to pull back the veil, revealing why. These hybrid beings did more than rule. They ravaged. Fields were stripped bare, rivers ran red, and humanity was reduced to trembling subjects or hunted prey. The watchers, having abandoned their posts of holy vigilance, looked on with satisfaction. Some even worshipped the monstrous children their lust had birthed. At last, heaven could stomach it no longer. According to Enoch, God's voice thundered across eternity, summoning the archangel Raphael. Imagine that solemn charge. As it rolled through the firmaments, take Samjaza and his band. Bind them with unbreakable chains. Cast them into the abyss, beneath the mountains of the earth. Shroud them in darkness. Let them taste silence, until the day when all accounts shall be settled. Notice they were not granted oblivion. Their punishment was to endure chained yet conscious, buried beneath the same earth that still bears the weight of their rebellion. As for the Nephilim, God's judgment was swift and cataclysmic. The flood came not merely to wash away human sin, but to scour the world of these monstrous inheritors, to drown their appetites and cauterize the wounds left by heaven's own exiles. Can you feel how this lost chapter trembles under your feet? How it changes everything you thought you knew? What if Genesis was not the serene dawn we once believed, but the beginning of a desperate reconstruction, a divine emergency plan, hastily unfurled to heal a creation already fractured by cosmic treason? But now, let the story pivot sharply in your mind, because here lies the cruel twist that many sacred halls have tiptoed around for centuries. The flood was never merely about Noah and his family building an ark amid scoffers. It was not solely about purging common human sin or resetting a morally bankrupt society. No, it was something far more disturbing. The flood was about erasing a memory too dangerous to echo in human hearts. It was the memory of a time when heaven, in a reckless act of generosity, or perhaps ambition, poured its highest secrets into mortal hands. And mankind, intoxicated by this sudden surge of divine power, overstepped every boundary, clawing their way toward godhood long before they were ever meant to stand the tall. The forbidden tree in Eden, that was merely a symbol, a poetic echo in a garden. But before that tree ever sank roots into soil, there had been a far darker feast of forbidden knowledge, a cosmic fire seized by hands too weak to bear its heat. And those who dared to touch it didn't just scorch themselves, they set the entire world ablaze. Now lean in and let this question whisper through your thoughts. Why would such a story be meticulously stripped away? Why carefully excise this thread from the sacred tapestry? Because it blurs the stark, comfortable lines between divine and mortal, between who was meant to be flawless and who was destined to fail. It tells us evil did not sprout first from man's idle curiosity, but from angels' beings fashioned by God's own direct brilliance. It suggests the fall of creation was not humanity's solitary stumble, but the fallout from heaven's own recklessness. Doesn't that send a tremor through the very pillars of the tale we've all been told? And suddenly, you find yourself compelled to ask, with a weight that feels almost dangerous, was Eden truly the first rebellion, or merely the first punishment? Could it be that the serpent who slithered through the garden shadows was not the original deceiver, but a survivor, a refugee from an earlier shattered war, slinking across fresh grass in the aftermath of a more ancient revolt? What if the knowledge of good and evil wasn't primarily a lesson in moral choice, but a key to ancestral memory, unlocking something older, something humanity inherited rather than invented? What if sin did not blossom first in Eden's dew-kissed silence, but was seated long before in heavenly courts that cracked under the weight of desire and ambition? Let that thought spiral outward. These are not idle theological riddles meant to amuse scholars behind monastery walls. They are questions that gnaw at the bedrock of everything. They expose a fracture running right through the narrative, a missing chapter which if recovered would remake our entire understanding of why humanity stands where it does, trembling between ruin and redemption. Because if this lost chapter is more than whispered legend, if it once truly adorned the opening pages of Genesis before trembling hands tore it away, then the implications are staggering. It means we carry not just Adam's guilt, but the echo of celestial failings, that we are haunted by heaven's missteps as much as our own. In what comes next, we'll follow that very fracture through the corridors of history. We'll sift through dust-caked ruins and charred scroll fragments, peer into faded scripts, in lost translations, all of which may hold fragile proofs that this chapter once existed and that someone somewhere went to extraordinary lengths to silence it. Because the past, no matter how deeply it is buried beneath the rubble of time and doctrine, has a way of clawing its way back to the surface, precisely when the world grows desperate enough, or perhaps brave enough to hear it. Part 4. The Dead Sea Scrolls and the Erased Clues. Now, let yourself be carried back to a sun-bleached cliffside along the Dead Sea in 1947. Picture a young Bedouin shepherd chasing a stray goat that darted into a narrow mouth of rock. He picks up a stone and hurls it inside, and instead of a hollow echo, there's the brittle shatter of clay. That single startled moment cracked open not just an ancient jar, but the locked vault of 2,000 forgotten years. No one standing there that day could have guessed that buried inside were manuscripts that would send shockwaves through the very foundation of biblical history. Within those silent, dust-choked caves of Qumran lay a hidden library meticulously sealed away by a community known as the Essenes. This wasn't just folklore scribbled by eccentric monks. It was a carefully guarded archive, a treasury of texts that included not only known scriptures, but startling alternative versions of Genesis, of Enoch, of the earliest world before ours. These weren't conspiracy scraps to be waved off by skeptics. They were sacred, sealed, hidden deliberately from the eyes of what the Essenes called a corrupted priesthood. Because to them, the official Hebrew Bible wasn't simply incomplete. It was intentionally cleansed, pared down, edited, reshaped by those desperate to keep power from slipping through their trembling fingers. So let's peer into these scrolls together. Among the crumbling parchment were copies of the book of 1st Enoch, a work-long thought swallowed by time. And there were fragments of Genesis 6, terrifying in their clarity, that painted an even darker portrait of angelic descent and hybrid corruption. Verses we don't find in any modern Bible. Can you imagine holding these fragile sheets, the ink flaking onto your fingertips, realizing you were reading words no living eye had seen for 2 millennia? But perhaps the most chilling find of all was a faint, almost ghostly marginal note. Next to a passage on divine judgment were these startling words, "And the Lord forbade the writing of these words." Stop and let that penetrate. What sort of revelation was so perilous, so world-tilting, that heaven itself slammed down a gag order? What truth was so volatile that God would not even permit it to be inscribed? This wasn't an isolated curiosity. Other Dead Sea Scrolls repeatedly murmur of forbidden knowledge, cryptic heavenly visions, and angelic rebellions, eerily aligned with stories absent from the Bible you likely have resting on your shelf. And here's where the plot thickens even further. Scholars began to notice that even the very structure of Genesis within these scrolls was subtly, sometimes dramatically different. Chapters drifted out of expected order, scenes appeared in new sequences, and curious phrases blinked in and out, like lost ghosts haunting the text. So naturally, scholars did what they always do. They compared. They pored over the 2 oldest substantial versions of the Hebrew Bible we possess. One was the Septuagint, a Greek translation produced in the 3rd century BCE. cherished by early Christians, and still echoing in Orthodox liturgies today. The other was the Masoretic text, a Hebrew compilation painstakingly codified between the 7th and 10th centuries CE, which forms the backbone of most modern Old Testaments. And what did they find? Not trivial variations of style, but profound differences of substance. In the Septuagint's Genesis 8, the story of the sons of God and the daughters of men is embroidered with more context, hinting heavily at a celestial human entanglement that the later Masoretic quietly mutes. The lifespans of patriarchs swing wildly between these versions, suggesting more than just scribal error. It points to deliberate chronological reshaping timelines, adjusted to serve later theological narratives. Even the figure of Enoch stands differently across these textual worlds. In some Septuagint passages, and especially in fragments among the Dead Sea Scrolls, he isn't merely a pious man who walked with God. He emerges instead as a scribe of righteousness, a profound intermediary between the divine and the earthly, entrusted with secrets that spanned the very architecture of creation and judgment. Isn't it unsettling to wonder how much of what we consider solid scripture might actually be a carefully curated echo of deeper, more unsettling stories? Could it be that entire layers were peeled away, not because they were false, but precisely because they unveiled too much? If the earliest editors feared these truths would shake faith's pillars, what does that imply about the raw power of what they tried to hide? So here we stand, staring into jars that once slumbered in desert silence, now whispering revelations that refuse to be ignored. What happens when the past, clawing its way back to daylight, collides with our comfortable doctrines? Because buried truths have an uncanny habit of resurfacing precisely when the world grows just desperate, or just daring enough to hear them again. Why do these differences matter so profoundly? Because each alteration, every small omission or subtle redaction, tells a tale of its own. It doesn't take the erasure of entire chapters to distort a story's heartbeat. A word removed here, a line delicately reshaped there. These are the surgical incisions that change destinies. And yet hidden in those tiny wounds might lie the very revelations that would have shown us what the Nephilim truly were, how the Watchers fell from luminous grace, and why God's judgment thundered down on the ancient world with such terrifying finality all long before Moses ever ascended Sinai to receive the Torah. Is it unsettling to realize that our modern Bibles might be elegant, carefully curated reconstructions that float atop deep waters, roiling with untold truths? Beneath them, older currents swirl stories of heavenly rebellions, hybrid offspring who devoured the earth, and divine decrees whispered with trembling urgency. Take, for example, one particular scroll, unearthed at Qumran, catalogued by scholars as 4Q 530, but hauntingly known as the Book of Giants. This tattered manuscript reaches beyond anything preserved in your typical pew Bible. It dares to peer into the tormented minds of the Nephilim themselves. It speaks of dreams that troubled these monstrous sons of angels, visions of towering trees ripped from the ground by a coming deluge of violent quarrels among angelic bloodlines, of an impending war, not fought by humans, but by the corrupted children of heaven themselves. Can you feel how this is no mere religious poetry? It is a window into a completely different cosmology, a lost worldview where divine beings stumbled, seeded chaos, and were then forcibly silenced, both by God's own judgment and by human scribes, who later shaped the Bible you hold today. Now circle back with me to that faint, breathless marginal note we encountered before. And the Lord forbade the writing of these words. Who was it that penned such a chilling confession? Was it a weary prophet who trembled at what visions had burned across his mind? A devout scribe who dipped his pen in ink while his hand shook with dread? Or could it even have been a watcher himself, steeped in regret, inscribing a final cryptic warning before the chains of divine justice dragged him down? Whoever it was, that fragile soul feared not just what was being written, but what might forever echo in memory. Because memory is power. It births legacy, fuels revolutions, sustains faith, or topples kingdoms. The truths buried in the sands of Qumran were never truly lost. They were entombed, sealed away, with the desperate hope they'd be forgotten. But the sands never keep secrets forever. They merely wait for a generation reckless or brave enough to start asking questions that rattle old altars. Why does Genesis read like a reconstruction of something shattered? Why do divine beings flood the earliest pages only to vanish into cryptic silence? Why does Scripture begin with darkness, with an earth groaning under an invisible weight, where surely there should have been a scream? And that is precisely where we now stand, peering into that abyss of silence, daring to listen for the echoes someone hoped you'd never hear. Because the question of why this lost chapter had to be hidden cuts deeper than theology. It speaks to raw control of narrative, control of devotion, control of destinies. When you mold the story, you mold the faith. You determine what generations will fear, what they will revere, what they will seek, and what they will dare never to touch. Someone somewhere, a council perhaps, or a solitary scribe at a candlelit table, ensured that the story we inherited would be neatly bounded, cleansed of these darker currents. They made sure we received not the whole truth, but a safe truth. So linger with me a moment longer, because in the next breath of this journey, we will lay hands on the pulsing heart of this cover-up. We'll explore who gained by banishing this chapter, to shadow who needed it forgotten, and why recovering it now might fracture everything you thought you knew about the story of God, humanity, and the ancient contracts that still ripple through your very veins. Part 5. Why it was hidden: power, fear, and the control of the sacred. Let us now dare to voice the question that trembles on the edges of countless sermons, but is almost never spoken aloud. Why would an entire chapter of Scripture, one possibly older than Genesis 1 itself, be meticulously erased from sacred memory? The answer is not heresy, nor is it blasphemy. In truth, it is something far more primal, far more potent power. Because imagine just for a breath, if this lost chapter truly once existed, woven into the earliest scrolls, a chapter that laid bare how angels, beings sculpted from heaven's own breath, rebelled, transgressed divine decrees, and descended to sow forbidden unions that split creation itself along ragged seams. This would not simply scandalize priests or startle devout readers. It would unravel the entire architecture of organized religion. Think of what happens to our sacred hierarchies if rebellion did not first take root in Eden's quiet grove, but in the very courts of heaven. If it was not humanity that first breached trust with God, but heaven's own radiant sentinels. If divine beings could burn with desire, trespass boundaries, and deliver illicit knowledge into mortal hands, then where truly lies the divide between them and us? What guarantee do we have that perfection ever reigned without fracture? The early priesthood understood precisely how destabilizing such a revelation would be. The scribes who inked holy texts by lamplight, the councils who pored over scrolls, selecting which to exalt and which to entomb, they did so not merely to safeguard divine truth, but also to fortify a fragile system. They weren't out to destroy faith. Quite the opposite. They were desperate to contain it. A contained faith is clean, manageable, tidy. It fits neatly inside temples built from polished stone, aligns with rituals passed from trembling hand to trembling hand, solidifies under the weight of titles and traditions. But this lost chapter, it is wild, uncontainable, a raging sea that refuses to be calmed. It tells us heaven is not a realm of flawless tranquility. That knowledge itself can be a double-edged blade, a gift that slices through innocence when grasped too soon. And so they did what any guardians of a delicate order would do. They buried it. They smothered it under layers of sanctioned scripture, hoping time would erase its breath. Consider this: some of the earliest gatherings that decided the fate of sacred texts were tangled in fierce debates over precisely these mysteries. The Council of Jamnia, around 90 TE, often cited in rabbinic tradition, wrestled with which writings to preserve within the emerging Jewish canon. And in the fledgling Christian church, early voices like Irenaeus and Tertullian openly quoted Enoch as authoritative truth. Enoch's vivid tales of angelic watchers and hybrid giants were read aloud to congregations who sat spellbound by the echoes of a cosmos at war. But then something shifted. As the institutional church swelled in influence, as doctrines calcified into creeds and bishops wore crowns heavier than some kings, these supernatural stories began to vanish from homilies. The watchers quietly dissolved into myth. The Nephilim morphed from monstrous hybrids into neat metaphors, safely abstracted from messy history. Why? Because doctrine demands structure, predictable walls that keep the wandering sheep in line. Mystery, by contrast, is a ravenous thing. It stirs hunger, ignites restless minds, drives people to ask questions that make rulers uncomfortable. And control, true control, depends on simplicity, a clean gospel, a sanitized Genesis, a creation tale that starts with God, man, and a simple tree, not with ancient wars, lusting angels, and cosmic secrets spiraling through time. Some rabbinical traditions even whisper that certain scribes were explicitly instructed to omit or obscure passages that might tempt the masses into dangerous speculation. And what is speculation really but the sacred art of thinking for yourself, of daring to probe beyond the veil, to wonder, why does God seem to regret his creation? In Genesis 6, why does Scripture drape a thick silence over Enoch's prophecies? Why do scrolls slumbering in desert caves murmur of a war that raged long before Adam ever opened his eyes? So here we stand, you and I, gazing into the breach of an ancient cover-up. Because what these choices reveal is not simply a hidden history, but a naked bid for power. Those who steered the sacred narrative understood a chilling truth. If you control the story, you control the faith. If you fence off the questions, you own the answers. They sculpted a version of divine history that would keep trembling souls inside safe lines, shielded from the untamed terrors that lurk behind Genesis' dark curtain. And that, perhaps, is the most profound revelation yet, that someone long ago decided the story you inherited wasn't the whole story. That they closed the gates, not to guard you from lies, but to shelter you from truths so immense they might have cracked open your very understanding of God creation and your place in the churning cosmos. The deeper truth is this: faith thrives on mystery, but control depends on silence. The earliest guardians of sacred texts didn't merely preserve the Word of God as fragile scribes, terrified of error. They became curators, architects of a narrative powerful enough to steer empires, humble kings, and shape the destinies of countless souls. And here lies the paradox, sharp enough to draw spiritual blood. In their fierce desire to protect the faithful, they may have inadvertently stolen from them the most profound chapter of their own origin. Because the lost chapter doesn't demolish belief. It doesn't crush trust in the divine. It does something far more unsettling. It complicates everything. It demands we see God not only as the serene artist who painted galaxies into the void, but also as a war commander, orchestrating legions in an ancient conflict that erupted long before humanity ever inhaled its first breath. And more chilling still, that war is not sealed safely in the past. Its shockwaves still ripple through our existence, pressing against our hearts in moments of unexplained awe, dread, and longing. This revelation isn't a weapon to turn against tradition. It's not an indictment of the early councils who met under candlelight, or the weary scribes who hunched over delicate scrolls, their hands blistered by years of devotion. It's not a crusade to brand ancient priests as villains. No, it's a sober acknowledgement that history is never merely a list of what happened. History is also a record of what was permitted to be told. And whenever spiritual power hardens into institutional power, the first thing that tends to vanish isn't heresy. It's the inconvenient truth that refuses to sit quietly in pews. Because this lost chapter is not just another story of a fall from grace. It reads like the aftermath of a cataclysm, a violent collision between entire realms, between orders of beings whose destinies were never meant to intertwine. It forces us to wrestle with an uncomfortable question: who gets to decide which souls have the right to know this cosmic scandal? Who gets to open that forbidden door? Understand this: the silence surrounding these truths was never an accident. It was a choice, deliberate and precise. It wasn't about shielding God's holiness from scrutiny. It was about protecting the intricate system painstakingly built around Him. Because if common believers knew that angels, the very paragons of celestial hierarchy, could defy God, could burn with illicit desire, could crash from brilliance into shadow, and still be held accountable, still stand trial under divine law, then what dangerous ideas might that awaken? Perhaps they'd glimpse a terrifying possibility that no hierarchy is ever beyond question. That rebellion is woven into the fabric of even the loftiest realms, and so authority, whether draped in robes of heaven or earth, can always be challenged. Now brace yourself, because we are about to pry open the hidden contents of that lost chapter. Not merely its words, but the theological shock waves it continues to hurl across time. We will explore the staggering architecture of the cosmos. It once described the catastrophic fall that redefined what evil even is, and the haunting notion that some knowledge was so incendiary, God Himself may have tried to seal it away from the eyes of creation. So whatever you do, don't look away, because what comes next is not just the climax of this mystery. It is its very heart, the pulse of a secret that has waited countless ages for you to finally lean close enough to hear it whisper your name. Part 6. You know what the lost chapter really says. Now lean even closer, because if this lost chapter ever truly existed, its aim would not have been mere spectacle. It wouldn't have existed to shock trembling mortals or shatter fragile faith. It would have been there to explain, to unveil all the questions we have dared to cradle in secret, yet feared to let dance across our lips. The fragments scattered through the Dead Sea Scrolls, the dire laments of Enoch, the uneasy silences that lie like hidden graves between verses in Genesis, they all pulse with the same buried heartbeat. And that heartbeat tells one devastating story. Before Adam ever fell, before Eve's fingers brushed against the skin of that fateful fruit, before the serpent's tongue unfurled a single syllable, heaven itself cracked wide open. The forbidden texts sketch out a breathtaking, almost sorrowful scene. They whisper of a divine council, an assembly of luminous beings, older than mountains, gathered in hush around God, as He prepared to do something no eye, not even angelic, had ever beheld. Can you picture it? The hush, the anticipation, the faint vibration of awe tinged with unease. Then from dust still warm from starfire, God shaped a form so humble, so fleeting, so achingly delicate. And into this fragile clay, he did the unthinkable. He breathed. His very breath became a soul, a spark of eternity imprisoned in fleeting flesh. That moment split the fabric of the heavens more profoundly than any war ever would. Because for the first time, these mighty watchers, beings wrought from pure spirit, older than the seas, faster than light, looked down and saw a creature who bore something they did not, the very image of God. This mortal, this creature, who would bleed, age, weep, and die, carried within its breast a reflection of the eternal that even they had never been granted. The watchers saw it. Some fell prostrate, worshiping God's unfathomable choice with trembling joy. But others stood rigid, their radiance flickering with dark questions. Why bestow upon them what we ourselves have never possessed? Why honor these transient specks of dust with an intimacy we, the faithful sentinels of countless eons, have never tasted? And then silence. Not because God had ceased to speak, but because a crack had formed across the vault of heaven, slender yet deep, a fissure that would in time become a yawning fault line. From that fault line seeped jealousy, apprehension, and the first ghostly threads of pride. Among the gathered hosts, debates flared like hidden wildfires. Some of the angels warned with grave foresight. They peered into the fragile corridors of human hearts and saw 1,000 futures unfurl, futures where men would use the gift of the soul to create wonders, yes, but also horrors, to build cities and weapons, to cherish and to betray, to choose paths that would echo rebellion. But there were others, cunning, ambitious, restless. They saw not risk, but unprecedented opportunity. If man bore a soul, he could be molded, instructed, enticed, perhaps even mastered. They reasoned, why should we not walk beside them, whisper to them secrets even God has reserved for himself? Why should we not shape this new clay into something that serves our designs? And thus began the first great schism in heaven, not a dispute over worship. All still bent the knee before the throne, but a sharp divide over whether God's newest creation, this fragile vessel of breath and blood, could truly be trusted, or whether it would become the greatest threat the cosmos had ever seen. Can you sense the weight of that moment? Can you almost hear it? The pregnant silence stretching across the celestial plains, the ripple of wings shifting uneasily, the dawning realization that nothing in the universe would ever be simple again. Because this was not just the seed of a fall, it was the birth of a debate that would shatter stars and mold the very battlefield upon which both angels and men would play out their destinies. And right there, at the dawn of all our stories, stands a chilling truth. The first cosmic question was not whether to worship God, but whether to trust what he loved most. The lost chapter, as whispered through strands of ancient lore and smoldering fragments of forbidden texts, paints a scene far more intricate and far more unsettling than anything your childhood Bible stories dared to reveal. It describes not simply a rebellion, but a catastrophic split among the hosts of heaven. A faction of angels known to us now as the Watchers made a decision that would scar the cosmos forever. They descended not merely in brazen defiance of God's sovereign command, but driven by something even more intoxicating: the hunger for access, the thirst for influence, the desperate yearning for legacy. They didn't just want to witness creation. They wanted to inscribe themselves upon it, to seed the world with a trace of their own essence that would echo down through the ages. What they bestowed upon mankind was not simply knowledge in the sterile sense lines of poetry, formulas for metallurgy, chants that bent spirits to will. No, what they gave was far darker. and far more intimate. They poured out their own longings, their restless fears, their unresolved rebellion, and these passed like a hidden contagion through bloodlines, through ritual, through mythologies that would swirl in humanity's veins for millennia, perhaps even through subtle temptations still whispered on the edge of dreams. And here, if you dare to peer into the shadows, lies the most chilling connection of all. What if the serpent who slithered through Eden's lush silence was never merely a snake? What if it was a being who once blazed among the stars, a radiant shining one in a chash, in Hebrew thought a bearer of light, who had stood near the very throne, cloaked in loyalty, until pride twisted his glory into a smoldering ruin? Imagine that same fallen brilliance, now reduced to coiled cunning, drawing close to Eve, with promises he once believed himself. You will be like God, knowing good and evil. But pause here, because that seductive line, it didn't originate beneath Eden's emerald canopy. It had been spoken long before, voiced in heavenly courts, by those who would not remain content under God's rule. It was their secret rallying cry, the spark that ignited their descent. In Eden, it was merely repeated, a haunting refrain designed to ensure humanity stumbled along the very fault line they had already torn open. The fall did not begin in Eden. It began in heaven. The garden was just the echo chamber. The fruit was only the trigger. The rebellion was already roaring forward, and mankind became its next willing vessel. Let this truth settle into your bones. It changes everything you thought you knew. That tree in the center of the garden was not merely a test of obedience. It was a mirror held up to reflect the rift that had already split the heavens. The temptation was not random, nor was it merely a moral lesson for later generations. It was engineered by a being who had once worn splendor as naturally as breath, a creature who lost everything and sought in his bitterness to make certain others would fall as he had. And the punishment that followed, it wasn't solely about human disobedience. It was a grim cycle, repeating itself, a divine heartbreak, replaying on a smaller, more fragile stage. So why tear this story from our hands? Why strip it from the pages of Genesis and bury it beneath layers of doctrine and silence? Because it compels us to gaze not only upon God's justice, but also upon his astonishing risk. Creating humanity was not a neat act of divine perfection. It was a daring leap into profound danger, a gamble so audacious that even heaven trembled. And the angel's darkest fears came true. For when man fell, he did not simply betray his maker. He flung open his arms to join a rebellion already raging among beings far older, far mightier, and far more desperate. Now pause again and breathe, because in the next turn of this journey, we will explore what all of this means for you right now. How does this hidden theology rewrite everything we believe about sin, redemption, and the restless aching of the human soul? Because if the lost chapter is not myth, but a shadowed memory of truth, then salvation isn't merely about returning to Eden's innocence. It's about settling a cosmic war that began long before our world ever turned beneath the sun. So hold fast, because what we are about to uncover might be the revelation that forever alters how you see God creation, and even the silent battleground that lies hidden inside your own heart. Part 7. Its impact today, and the question we can no longer avoid. Now imagine, just for a trembling heartbeat, that the lost chapter is real, that it was never mere legend or shadowy rumor passed down by mystics, that the tale of the Watchers, their forbidden descent, the secrets of heaven scattered like poisoned seeds across a newborn world, was once inscribed in sacred memory, right alongside the creation of light and seas. What does that mean for us, here and now, living thousands of years later, under the same sky that once watched angels fall? It means that the faith we inherited, precious though it is, was handed to us, with a page quietly torn out. We began at Genesis 1, nodding solemnly. In the beginning, God created, never suspecting that a previous prologue lay missing a hidden scroll that might have explained why darkness already brooded over the deep, why creation began not from absolute emptiness, but from a chaos that felt eerily like aftermath. That long silence has done more than hide history. It has shaped everything we believe enough about who we are, why we suffer, and what God is ultimately rescuing us from. For countless generations, we've been taught a simpler, cleaner line, that the fall began with Adam, that sin was born the instant he bit into disobedience, that evil was an invader, a snake that slithered into an otherwise flawless garden. But the lost chapter suggests something far more difficult to swallow, that by the time Adam opened his eyes, the world was already cracked, because heaven itself had already fractured. That sin didn't so much break into Eden as echo there. If that's true, then the implications are so seismic, they shake the very ground beneath our doctrines. Can angels truly rebel? The question isn't hypothetical anymore. The answer is yes, they already did. And their legacy still coils through our veins, lingers in our ambitions, flickers in our darkest dreams. Can knowledge destroy as well as heal? Apparently, yes. Not all revelation stitches wounds. Some tears them wider, awakening longings the soul is not yet tempered to bear. Did God truly create humanity with absolute freedom, knowing precisely how that freedom could spiral, how it could birth love so fierce it would move mountains, and betrayal so cold it would freeze stars? That is the question few theologians want to linger over, because it doesn't point to a careless or indifferent creator. It points to an astoundingly courageous one, a God who sculpted beings capable of loving him by choice, and therefore also capable of breaking his heart. And here's where this ancient story crashes straight into our present lives. Perhaps the real peril was never the tree in the middle of Eden. Perhaps it was the silence that stretched out before the tree, the silence that kept us ignorant of the war, already smoldering across eternity. Because if we had known, if the lost chapter had remained in place, to tell us of angelic thrones, toppled by pride of heavens, that trembled before humanity ever drew breath, of a universe staggered by seduction and ambition, would we have read the Bible the same way? Would we have seen it merely as a moral handbook, a tidy list of do's and don'ts? Or would we have recognized it for what it truly is, a cosmic rescue mission orchestrated by a God willing to enter his own wounded creation to heal a rift that began long before we ever stumbled? Pause here and let that echo in your chest, because maybe this isn't just a story about ancient beings or far-off rebellions. Maybe it's about why your own soul sometimes strains against unseen chains, why your spirit sometimes aches over something you can't quite name, some lost home, some ancient loyalty you can barely remember. If the lost chapter is true, then every page of scripture we've ever read becomes more than law. It becomes a battlefield report, a love letter sent from the front lines of a war that began before the world began and still rages quietly within us. Across the quiet corridors of modern scholarship, among Jewish sages poring over ancient commentaries, among Christian theologians who delicately balance creed and curiosity, and even among secular historians piecing together the evolution of myth, there is a hushed, almost reluctant consensus. They will say it behind the polished doors of private seminars, scribble it in elusive footnotes, murmur it over coffee far from sanctuaries and lecture halls. There are unmistakable gaps woven into Genesis 1 through 6. Gaps where something should be. Verses that feel like cautious responses to a catastrophe never openly described. Stories that begin in the dim light, after a storm, the winds already dying down, the debris already scattered, yet no one dares say what came crashing through. The narrative of Genesis feels as if it rises out of a crater. It begins after a conflict, with echoes of something older, still vibrating through its lines, older traditions quietly suppressed, locked away in the hidden chambers of private papers or carefully hedged scholarly conversations. And these scholars, despite all caution, admit something critical. Something has been left out. But few will say it outright, because to admit it, with full voice, is to pick up the foundation stones of faith itself and turn them over, peering into cracks that could reshape everything we ever thought we knew. But perhaps the issue isn't that God didn't once speak these truths. Perhaps it's that humanity wasn't yet ready to hear them. Maybe we were still too fragile, too easily shattered by the weight of cosmic heartbreaks and divine risks. But look around now. Technology races ahead of our moral compass, faster than our collective soul can catch up. A spiritual hunger gnaws at the heart of a world drowning in data, yet starving for wisdom. Lost texts keep clawing their way back to daylight, and questions that would once have sparked accusations of heresy now hover openly in pulpits, dance on the lips of cautious professors, slip between the lines of modern commentaries. The story isn't dead. It's clawing its way back, not to obliterate faith, but to deepen it, to stretch it, until it fits the vastness of a cosmos still trembling from ancient wars. What if faith was never meant to be neat, predictable color inside the lines certainty? What if real faith demands we step willingly into mystery, into questions that bleed, instead of heal, into shadowed places where even angels trembled before us? And here you are now, of all generations, standing as a witness to a narrative long buried, a chapter that may never be recovered in ink, but still pulses beneath the surface of human instinct. It sings in your dreams. It sighs in those quiet, unexplainable moments when your heart aches with a homesickness for something you can't name, that gentle, haunting voice that whispers, "There's more. There has always been more." So where does that leave us? What do you do when confronted with a God who chooses to create in the shadow of rebellion, who plants gardens on battlefields still warm from celestial war? How do you read a Bible that may begin not with untouched perfection, but with aftermath, with the careful reconstruction of a world already bearing scars? How do you embrace a faith that was never designed to be caged by institutions, neat doctrines, or rigid traditions, but instead calls to be lived recklessly, courageously, dangerously? These are not simply academic questions to debate under vaulted ceilings or pinned to seminary papers. They are profoundly personal, because if the lost chapter is true, even in fragments, even in haunting echoes, then every human soul carries inside it the faint memory of a war it never saw, a war that shaped the universe into the crucible where your own story would one day ignite. And with that memory comes a weight, a burden, a choice you must now make, whether to turn away and pretend the story was always simple, or to step into the deeper current and let it carry you wherever this dangerous truth might lead. And so we stand at a threshold. In the next part of this journey, we will turn our eyes from the long shadows of history and look squarely at meaning. What does it truly mean to live in the aftermath of the lost chapter? What fierce lessons still burn under the centuries of silence? How does this ancient fracture rewrite your sense of identity, your divine purpose, and your place in a saga so much larger than any creed ever dared confess? Don't move away now, because what comes next might be the revelation that finally stitches all these haunting pieces into a vision of God and of yourself you were always meant to see. Part 8. Truth doesn't end faith, it restarts it. We began this strange pilgrimage together, cradling a mystery, a hollow inside Genesis so vast it felt intentional, like a pause too heavy to be accidental. We wandered through ancient ruins and dusty vaults of forbidden books. We followed fallen angels down the corridors of eternity, listened to warnings scrawled by trembling scribes, pieced together, erased whispers from scrolls, left to rot in caves. And now, at the ragged edge of all these revelations, we finally reach the most piercing question of all. What do we do when the truth we uncover refuses to comfort us, but instead stand toe-to-toe with us and demand we look deeper? For so many souls, faith has been a sanctuary of bright certainties, a hearth around which the frightened and weary gather. It has been an ark in the storm, a lantern in the choking dark. But this lost chapter, this forbidden story of watchers who stepped beyond divine bounds of a cosmos already cracked before humanity's first breath, it doesn't hand us tidy answers. Instead, it lays in our open palms something far more sacred: questions. And questions, though they may unsettle us, are holy ground. Because make no mistake, this isn't only a tale about giants and angels, about floods and cosmic courts. It is about you. Hidden beneath this sweeping narrative is not a test of intellect, but a trial of spirit. Could you still be faithful if the story is bigger, stranger than you ever dreamed? Could you cradle a truth in your hands that feels heavier, darker, more tangled than the polished faith you once held, yet discover in that weight something more startlingly honest? And would you dare let your faith be reborn, not nestled in the cozy certainty of pat doctrines, but flung wide into the wild terrain of holy wonder? Here's a reality no council of theologians can seal away. With decrees, the questions remain. The watchers who vanished from canon still stand in the shadows of forgotten scrolls. The Nephilim who stride briefly through Genesis loom far larger in Enoch's mournful prophecies. The tree in Eden, we've always called it a symbol of knowledge, but what if it was also a mirror of memory echoing choices made long before in celestial halls? And that serpent, could it have been more than a mere reptile? Could it have been the ghost of an older rebellion, slithering out of eternity's wounds to whisper its ancient defiance again? These aren't loose threads to be clipped. They are trail markers bright, even if blood-stained, left for seekers with eyes willing to see and hearts daring enough to follow. Perhaps you were never meant to receive faith like a rote script recited by rote tongues. Perhaps you were meant to live it like a quest, to wander through the shadowed valleys as much as bask on the sunlit hills. And maybe, just maybe, that's why this chapter vanished, not to punish us, but to awaken us. Because a truth handed to you is far too easy to dismiss or to twist into comfort. But a truth wrestled from history, pieced together through fragmented voices echoing across millennia, becomes something else entirely. It becomes your own. So what if the missing chapter was never lost on brittle parchment, but always waiting to be uncovered within your spirit? What if it lives in that gnawing hunger that never quite goes away, the feeling that Genesis opens like a house with an unseen fire, already smoldering in its walls, in the chill that dances down your spine when you hear of fallen stars and forbidden teachings, in the subtle ache when you read how quickly Scripture moves on from mysteries it never fully answers? What if the lost chapter was never meant to be read in ink at all, but discovered like a hidden room inside your own soul? Because the deepest truths are not locked in vaults. They live breathing, waiting to be read, not just with your eyes, but with the raw courage of a searching heart. Here's a twist no one expects. The most life-shaking revelations rarely come from new facts alone. Often they burst forth When you finally realize the old story was never finished, that every sacred text is less a sealed box and more a living conversation, a holy dialogue between God and man, between heaven's fierce light and earth's trembling soil, between what we think we know and what eternity still longs to whisper. And perhaps that's the staggering point. Maybe the lost chapter was not ripped away at all, but entrusted, placed carefully into the hands of generations willing to seek it out, hearts humble enough to listen for truths too wild for safe religion. So now the final question arcs back to you. Like a thrown blade, you've heard what was hidden. You've brushed your fingers across the forgotten and felt the chill of old rebellions stirring. You've sensed the gaps between the verses, heard the sighs from buried scrolls. What will you do with this? Will you close the door, retreat to the sheltered faith you knew before locking out the winds that carry darker tales? Or will you dare to step into the deeper waters where the story doesn't end, but begins again, vaster, more dangerous, and yet more beautiful than you ever imagined? Because real faith does not flinch before mystery. It walks toward it, hands unclenched, eyes unblinking. And as we stand on the edge of this journey's last threshold, it's no longer scholars or scrolls that matter most. It's you, the listener, the quiet keeper of memory, the bearer of questions too sacred for crowds, and hopes too profound for shallow creeds. Now, in this final stretch of our journey, I want to speak directly to you, you who have walked long with God, you who have borne the seasons on your shoulders, whose faith has weathered storms and outlived shifting tides. Stay with me here, because what I'm about to share is crafted especially for your spirit. This is a message for the ones who have carried sacred truths through decades that changed everything around you. The world evolved, traditions bent, yet you stood steadfast. You've watched doctrines grow simpler, even as life grew more complex. You've seen mystery traded for slogans, deep questions shelved in favor of neat answers. And yet, if you're honest, something deep inside you has always known, faith was never meant to be a refuge from mystery. It was always meant to be the bold embrace of it. The story of the lost chapter isn't merely about dusty scrolls unearthed from caves or ancient angels whose names slip like shadows across forbidden texts. It's about the bravery to keep searching, to keep asking even after a lifetime spent believing. Perhaps, dear soul, the chapter was never truly lost from Scripture at all, only from our collective memory. And perhaps God entrusted it to hearts like yours, not to tear down everything you've built your life upon, but to take you deeper still, to teach those who come after you that God does not tremble at questions, and truth is never something to fear. Because real wisdom was never found in knowing every secret of the universe. It's discovered at the very edge of the unknown, where your heart quivers with awe, where you see how vast He truly is, and you choose still to trust. Even there, especially there, that lingering silence in Genesis is not a mistake or a crack in the foundation of your faith. It's an open door for the brave. It's an invitation for the faithful, the weathered, the seasoned, to step forward to explore, to pass on a heritage of belief that is raw and living and unafraid, to venture into the dark places where God's light burns brightest. You, precious one, are not standing at the end of this story. You are one of its keepers, a living testimony meant to hand forward a faith that dares to face both wonder and shadow without flinching. And so, if this message has stirred something in you, if it's challenged you, comforted you, or even left you wrestling with holy tension, I invite you to stay connected. Subscribe to this channel so you don't miss the next chapter of these revelations. Like this video if it spoke to you, and share it so that others might dare to explore these mysteries too. And if you feel led, You can also bless this work through a super thanks. Every gift, every comment, every moment you spend here fuels this mission to unearth truth and spread it across the world. And whether you give or simply walk this path with us in spirit, know how deeply I thank you. May God bless you with courage, with eyes wide open to His mysteries, and with a heart that remains tender to His whisper, even in the dark places. Remember, your story isn't finished. In many ways, it's only just beginning.